of lectures on 18th Constitutional Amendment. As a student of politics and history of Pakistan, I have tried to understand the 18th Amendment in the context of Pakistan's constitutional development over the years. Luckily, when this amendment was being drafted, we were, as part of a civil society organization, Center for Civic Education, for monitoring what was happening, and thereafter also we looked into what has been the impact of this amendment. I will share some of my views with you. My talk will cover three major areas. First of all, I'll try to suggest why federalism is so important for Pakistan. Then I'll look into the 18th Amendment. And finally, we will see what challenges are ahead, to what extent 18th Amendment has been successful, to what extent it has been accepted by the society and implemented upon. So, first of all, I would say that Pakistan is one of the 28 countries of the world who have adopted federalism as their form of governance. Almost 40% population of the world lives under federal systems, and there have been waves of federalism in history, starting from United States and Switzerland, and then the breakup of the empires, which resulted in the formation of another set of federal states, and after the collapse of Soviet Union, we saw the third wave of federal countries emerging. As far as Pakistan is concerned, three very important historical aspects should be kept in mind as far as the choice of federalism was concerned. First of all, I would say that the entire freedom movement, which culminated in the creation of Pakistan, can be well understood if one looks into the nature of political demands made by the Muslim League after the emergence of a Muslim separatist platform in India. Right from the beginning, Muslim League had been asking for autonomy for the Muslim majority provinces, but when Quaid-e-Azam joined Muslim League, and particularly after the introduction of the Government of India Act 1919, the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, we see that politics in India was provincialized. And in that context, it was but important for Muslim League to have its roots in the Muslim majority provinces if it had to have any say in the high politics of India. At that time, there were only two Muslim majority provinces, and Muslim demand for a fair share in the all India politics and in the new institutions which were emerging was based on the numerical strength of the Muslims, which was not that much. 23 or 24% of population of India was Muslim. But then after 1919, when it emerged that a federal setup had to be set up in India, the number of provinces became important. So we see that in 1927, when Delhi Muslim proposals were presented, the crux of the demand was this, that if three more Muslim majority provinces are created in the form of separation of Sindh from Bombay and extension of reforms in northwest frontier and Balochistan, that would have amounted to the creation of 5 Muslim majority provinces. So in the federal matrix of India, the voice of the Muslims would have increased had that happened. So in 1927, Delhi Muslim proposal, Jinnah Sahab proposed this, that if these three Muslim majority provinces are also created, he would be ready to give up separate electorate, and this is very important because separate electorate was one major demand for which the Muslim League was created. Thereafter, in 1928-29, in the 14 points of Mr. Jinnah in the roundtable conferences, where he pleaded for provincial autonomy, and in the subsequent years up until the Lahore Resolution of 1940. The emphasis of Muslim separatist politics was on provincial autonomy. So the rationale of federalism in Pakistan comes also from our particular and peculiar freedom movement. It was politically, it was couched in the language of two-nation theory, but beneath this, the actual political demand was for provincial autonomy. And Jinnah Sahab, right from the beginning, was saying that he was asking for maximum autonomy and same quantum of autonomy for all the provinces. So this should be kept in mind, that Pakistan came into being in the context of this political constitutional development. The second rationale of Pakistan's federalism comes from the modalities of partition. When it was decided that India had to be divided, it was the Muslim majority provinces who were asked if they wanted to join the Indian Federation or the Federation of Pakistan. It was the provincial assemblies of Sindh, Punjab and Bengal who had to decide about the fate of their provinces, and the Muslim members of these provincial assemblies had to decide. So Sindh decided in favor of a federation for Pakistan, so did Punjab. In the case of Bengal, before the Muslim members could sit together and decide, the Congress members got together and they voted for their choice to be part of Indian Federation. So that's how East Bengal came to Pakistan. And we all know that the fate of Northwest Frontier province was decided by a referendum, and in the case of Balochistan, the Quetta municipality decided. So from this, I want to derive this argument that the Federation of Pakistan was in fact created by the federating units. It is not that the center had created the Federation of Pakistan. It was the provinces which shaped the Federation of Pakistan, and this is very important in order to understand the subsequent demands of the provinces and the politics of provincial autonomy in Pakistan. The third important rationale comes from the society. Pakistan has always been a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual society. It had been a plural society, and such societies are called federal societies. In federal societies, the demands of the society, the diverse demands of the society can only be addressed by a set of institutions which reflect the aspirations of the people, and therefore federation or federal form of government was best suited for Pakistan. This was realized even before the creation of the country, and we know that Quaid-e-Azam had always been saying before 1947 that Pakistan would be a federation like the federations of Australia and Canada. So one should be clear about the rationale of federalism in Pakistan. Unfortunately, after 1947, what realized in the country was an overly centralized system. Right in the beginning, a military bureaucratic alliance emerged, which was not appreciative of the conditions of the country, and therefore a centralized system was imposed on the country. The Government of India Act 1935 is served as the interim constitution for 9 years, also facilitated this process of centralization. In 1958, military took over, and though it was a martial law, but it was a joint venture of military and bureaucracy. We see that after 24 years, Pakistan broke down and East Pakistan emerged as a separate country, Bangladesh. Thereafter, we made the 1973 Constitution. Now, this was the third regular constitution of the country, 1956, 1962, and 1973. Almost all of these constitutions were overly centralized. Justice Dara Patel used to say that the spirit of 1935 Act, in fact, incubulates in all the three constitutions of Pakistan. 1973 Constitution was way ahead of the two previous constitutions in the sense that the first two constitutions were not made by constituent assemblies which had been elected by the people. 1956 Constitution was made by an assembly which was indirectly elected by the provincial assemblies, and the 1962 Constitution was given by Ayub Khan in his personal capacity, and it was later voted by the National Assembly and accepted by it. So 1973 Constitution, even though it had some in form it was federal, but in spirit it was, I would say, organic federalism, because all major powers were in the hands of the central government. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution, Mr. Bhutto had given words to the opposition leaders that in 10 years' time the whole constitutional package would be revisited and the concurrent list would be abolished. This was something he said to Mir Bosbash Bizenjo, who was the governor of Balochistan and was a member of the Constituent Assembly. Later this was confirmed by Mr. Abdul Hafiz Pirzada, who was at that time the long lister. Though we don't find it written anywhere, but this has been what these leaders have been saying in public, in the press, and luckily I interviewed both of them. Mir Bosbash Bizenjo told this to me in 1981 when I interviewed him as a student of Masters, and in 1985 I interviewed Mr. Pirzada in London. He went to the extent of saying that we had given a moratorium of 10 years, which means that after 10 years the concurrent list had to be abolished in any way. So the abolition of the concurrent list had been on the political agenda, and during the MRD movement in 1981, 82, 83, and thereafter in the programs of the political parties, and in 2006 when a Charter of Democracy was signed between Mohtarama Benazir Bhutto and Mr. Nawaz Sharif, this was reiterated. So after 2008 elections, when a Constitution Committee was formed to review the Constitution, to suggest amendments in it, the abolition of concurrent list was on the top of the agenda. Now, what the 18th Amendment has done, that is very important to look. I would say at and this I have been saying at different places, that it's a major transformation in constitutional history of Pakistan. It's a paradigm shift. Mr. S.M. Zafar has called it the transformation of Pakistan's federation from organic to cooperative federalism. The same has been said by Mr. Raza Rabbani in his book. So this is very significant. I would go to the extent of saying that after 1919, this is the major shift in the constitutional history of this region, because here we have a totally different way of thinking towards the issues of governance, and for the first time after 1919, so much has been given to the provinces. Unfortunately, many provincial autonomists do not accept this. I have a number of friends among the Sindhi nationalists and the Baloch nationalists, and I try to explain that you should see the 18th Amendment in the context of what you had in the past. It's a major shift. What the 18th Amendment has done, primarily 18th Amendment has affected two areas of our political system. First, it has shifted the presidential form of government back to the parliamentary form. We know that in 1973 it was it was a parliamentary system with a very powerful prime minister, so much so that it was suggested that if a vote of no confidence or a resolution regarding a vote of no confidence was presented against the prime minister, the name of alternate prime minister should also be mentioned in this resolution. So that was one way of increasing the powers of the prime minister. Parliamentary system is not about the powers of the prime minister. Parliamentary system is about the powers of the parliament. So instead of making the parliament supreme, 73 constitution had actually made the prime minister more powerful. But he was very rightly powerful vis-a-vis the president, because in parliamentary systems, president is a titular head. In the 8th Amendment, General Ziaul Haq shifted the whole parliamentary tilt of the system towards the presidential system. And not only this, but the president was given the power to dissolve the assembly. He was given the power to decide on his discretion who should be the prime minister. Therefore, Muhammad Khan Junejo was a hand-picked man of Ziaul Haq. He later got vote of confidence from the Parliament, National Assembly. Similarly, the Article 58(2)(b) had been a cause of instability in the system in the years to come, because 58(2)(b) was first exercised by Ziaul Haq himself when he removed the government of Muhammad Khan Junejo in 1988. Then President Isa Khan used this clause in 1990 when the government of Benazir Bhutto was removed. Then in 1993, Mian Nawaz Sharif's first government was removed. So 8th Amendment, which had made the system presidential, was repealed partially when in 1997, during his second tenure, Nawaz Sharif was successful in passing the 13th constitutional amendment, which made the system parliamentary once again, and 58(2)(b) was removed. Now in 2002, elections were held and General Parvez Musharraf once again made the system presidential. And through the 17th Amendment, 58(2)(b) was brought back to the Constitution, and those powers which had been conceived for the Prime Minister in 1973, they were all given to the President. So 18th Amendment's one major success has been this: it has shifted the system back to parliamentary, and it is very significant that not only 58(2)(b) was removed, but the presidential power to appoint the services chiefs, his power to appoint the governors, these have been removed. And now the president appoints the governors not in consultation with the Prime Minister, but on the advice of the Prime Minister. Previously, it was in consultation with the Prime Minister, which meant that President was free to accept the advice of the Prime Minister or not. But 18th Amendment has made it binding on the President to take the advice from the Prime Minister, and that advice is binding. So we see that the system has once again taken back to its original parliamentary shape. The second area where the 18th Amendment has been very successful is this devolution of powers. And in this devolution of power, we see that I'll not go into all the articles which empower the provinces. For example, there is Article 144, which says that Parliament can legislate for a province, but the province has now been given the power to repeal or to amend the Parliament's Act. Similarly, in case the province entrusts some of its functions to the Federation, in that case also 18th Amendment says that the Provincial Assembly can ratify this decision within 60 days. What is more important is the abolition of the concurrent legislative list. A couple of provisions or subjects which were earlier mentioned in the concurrent list have been given to the federal list. And I may mention, since there are a number of students sitting here, we adopted this LISP system from 1919, and that exercise continued after independence also. In the Government of India Act 1935, there were three legislative lists: federal list, concurrent list, and the provincial list. The same pattern continued in 1956 Constitution, with the difference that certain new subjects were given to the Federation. For example, sales tax was with the provinces in 1935 Act. But after partition, it was said that since the federal government doesn't have sufficient resources, the sales tax should be given to it for the time being. But in 1956 Constitution, it was regularized, and thereafter it continued to remain with the Federation. In that sense, 1956 Constitution was more centralized as compared to 1935 Act. Similarly, the subject of education, which is issue of contestation even today in Pakistan, 1935 Act had given education to the provinces, with the exception of just two universities, Aligarh Muslim University and Hindu University Banaras, which were with the center or the Federation, but all other education was with the provinces. But from 1956 it was put in the concurrent list, and in the 1973 Constitution also it was in the concurrent list. And we see that there gradually the federal government, if I may use the word, encroached upon the autonomy of the provinces, and gradually the whole of education went to the Federation. In the 1962 Constitution, Ayub Khan fiddled with the list system. There was only one list, that was federal list. And it was said that we have left all the powers to the provinces. They were declared as residuary powers. But if you look at the items of the federal list of 1962 Constitution, you will find out that in each item they have coupled a number of other items also. For example, there is item number 1, then you will find A, B, C, D, and that's how a number of subjects have been accumulated in the federal list. So, though the total number of items are just 49, the real effect of the Federalist is this, that it covers almost all those powers which were there with the Federation in the 1956 Constitution. 1973 Constitution had only two lists. One was the Federal list and the other was concurrent. In the concurrent list, the items mentioned there could be legislated upon by both the center as well as the provinces. But whoever made the law first, the prevalence was given to the federal law. Then in the federal list, there were two sections, section 1 and 2. In section 2, those items were put which were of interest for the provinces also. And for that, an institution was created, that is Council of Common Interest, which was given the power to sort of consider the interests of different provinces and resolve their issues if they are brought before the council. Now, what the 18th Amendment has done, it has shifted one or two items from the concurrent list to the Federal List Part 2. One item from the Federal List Part 1 has been shifted to the Part 2 of the Federal List, but more important is the abolition of the rest of the concurrent list. This means that a number of subjects have gone to the provinces. As a result of the 18th Constitutional Amendment, 17 federal ministries had to be dissolved, and these subjects have been shifted to the provinces. Something like 34 functions have been moved to the provinces, which means that now the provinces arena of competence and their arena of functions have enlarged and fairly enlarged. Similarly, in order to see the new federation, one major and a very significant aspect is the Council of Common Interest, which has emerged as a very important body, and I personally think that the fate of Pakistan's federation and federalism in Pakistan would largely depend on the functioning and the work of the Council of Common Interest. The council has been reshaped. Now the Prime Minister is the chair of the council. All the 4 chief ministers are members of this council. There are 3 federal ministers or representatives of the federal government. So there are 8 candidates, 4 from the Federation and 4 coming from the 4 provinces. The council has a secretariat. Its functions are quite wide. It formulates policies, regulates them, and supervises them. It looks into the operation of different institutions, and the council is established within 30 days of the election of the Prime Minister, and it is bound to meet at least once in 90 days. It also resolves the issues pertaining to electricity. Then there is National Economic Council. It is also presided by the Prime Minister. There are 4 chief ministers, 4 members nominated by the chief ministers, and 4 nominated by the Prime Minister. There are total 13 members in the National Economic Council. It is not that powerful and that important as the Council of Common Interest is, because National Economic Council is primarily an advisory body. But one good thing about it is this, that when all the provinces come and sit together, they can share their perceptions about economic planning. They can share their vision with each other, and this is one very important intergovernmental organization, intergovernmental institution in Pakistan's constitution now. Then there is National Finance Commission. You must be reading news about National Finance Commission, which is in session these days. Yesterday it met in Islamabad, and today's newspapers have reported the type of differences which have emerged this time round, because the seventh NFC award was quite successful in bringing all the provinces together and in evolving a consensus on the distribution of resources and the formula which was devised. NFC had done one or two very important things, seventh NFC. First of all, it had adopted a multiple criteria for the division of resources among the provinces. Earlier, it was only the criterion of population on the basis of which resources from the divisible pool of the provinces, resources were given to different provinces. But then Sindh had this complaint that we generate more revenue, but we get according to our population, and this is not fair with us. Balochistan would say that we are only 5% of the population, but we have 45% of the total territory of Pakistan. In our case, infrastructure is quite extensive, so our share of 5% would not be sufficient. So similarly, WFP had its demands. Seventh award was successful in evolving a multiple criteria for the division of resources, and it was decided that of the divisible pool, certain percentage would be allocated for on the basis of population, certain percentage would be divided according to the revenue generation, etc., etc. Similarly, NWFP was given 1% additional for to meet the cost of the effects of this Pakistan's joining the war against terrorism, which had affected the infrastructure of NWFP. Now, according to newspaper reports today, NWFP is asking for 3% increase of 2% in this additional allocation. Similarly, Balochistan says that the share of provinces given on the basis of population there, Balochistan should be given more, and that would mean that Punjab's share should reduce to by 1% more, which Punjab is not accepting. Dr. Aisha has said it before in an interview in Dawn that this time round Punjab would not sacrifice. Last time he did. Similarly, Sindh is asking for more resources. But one should not be much concerned about these types of debates, because this is an ongoing process in a federal system. Even in Germany, in United States, in Canada, whenever the issue of division of resources comes, there is contestation between provinces. Actual thing and more important thing is, are the institutions working? Are the institutions alive? Is the Council of Common Interest, is the National Finance Commission active and functional? That is more important. Differences can be sorted out, and differences after being sorted out, there would be another set of differences next time round. So this is an ongoing process. What is more important, and that I will discuss when I will be talking about the challenges to the system, that institutions should be seen as functioning to the optimal. So then there are emergency provisions, and there are also, if the President proclaims emergency in a province, then approval of the Parliament is needed within 10 days. That makes the federal government, that imposes a constraint on the federal government, and it prevents it from imposing emergency on will. Now, as far as the resources of the provinces are concerned, 18th Amendment would be regarded in the annals of our constitutional history as an important development, keeping in view the decision that the ownership of mineral and coastal resources has been divided now. Earlier, all ownership of mineral and coastal resources was with the federal government. 18th Amendment has given 50% ownership to the Federation and the 50% to the provinces. This has taken Pakistan's Federation much ahead of Indian Federation, where all coastal and mineral resources are with the federal government. But we are way behind Canada, where all resources are with the provincial governments. But whatever we have achieved through 18th Amendment is itself quite noticeable and quite important, I would say. So this much about the main features of 18th Amendment. As I have mentioned that it has been a major landmark in our constitutional history. But after having said all this in praise of 18th Amendment, I would now try to have a critical evaluation of what has happened thereafter. 5 years have passed since the adoption of 18th Amendment, and 5 years is a sufficient period, quite an adequate period to see if the system has been implemented upon properly or not, or what have been the failures. Let's talk about the institutional framework. I have talked about the Council of Common Interest, how important it is. So much so that it is said that when Mr. Nawaz Sharif became Prime Minister and he found out that this subject is going to the Council of Common Interest and this is going to the Council of Common Interest and this would be discussed in the Council of Common Interest, it is said that he remarked that then what the cabinet is there for, what the cabinet would do. So on the one hand, we have Council of Common Interest, which has executive powers, which has powers to oversee the implementation, which has the power to supervise the institutions which are sort of regulating the affairs which come under the domain of Council of Common Interest. But as I mentioned, that Council's reports should be presented to the Parliament and to the provincial assemblies regularly. The first report was put before the Parliament in March or April 2012. And mind it, the amendment was passed in April 2010. So after some 1.5 years or 2 years, the first report was presented to the Parliament. It was never discussed in the Parliament, neither in the Senate nor in the National Assembly, nor in any of the provincial assemblies. Then it was only, I think, after the election of Mr. Raza Rabbani as the chairman of the Senate that the report was presented for discussion. The report itself is not coming regularly. So far, only 3 reports have been printed, and about 4th it is said that it is about to be printed. The council itself is not meeting on a regular basis. And here, it's not the federal government alone which should be blamed for it, because the meeting of the Council of Common Interest can be called by the provinces also, or the request of the province also. So we see that there is something missing on both ends, in the federation as well as in the provinces, that they are not making this institution as functional as it should be. what has come before us in the last 5 years by way of implementation of the 18th Amendment, one major drawback was the very limited time for the transition period. It was decided that within 1 year, this whole engineering of the Constitution would be done. And 1 year is too small a period for such a gigantic constitutional engineering where 17 federal ministries were being abolished and provinces were given so much of work to do and to adopt new sort of ministries. A lot of legislation had to be done at the center as well as in the provinces. Perhaps 100 laws had to be made or to be repealed or to be amended by the federal parliament in order to regularize this whole constitutional engineering. At the end of the provinces also, a number of new laws had to be made, and the pace with which these laws are being made is quite slow. A few months back, I went to Quetta to find out. I was told that some 27 new laws have been made in the last 4.5 years. The performance of the Sindh Provincial Assembly is also not that good. I don't know much about what happened in NWFP and in Punjab. So the process is very slow. The transition period should have been long. And I quote two examples of the importance of any transition period. You're mostly historians. You would appreciate the fact that in 1947, the massive uprooting of the people and the massive violence that took place was also due to the reason that the transition period was too small. Soon after the partition plan was announced, it was decided that in August 1947, this partition would realize. So in order to manage this whole transition, in order to manage this whole partition, the time was very limited. And instead of blaming this party or that party, instead of blaming Muslim League or Congress, I personally think that the colonial rule was more responsible for mismanaging the partition of India. The success story is that of South Africa, where after the election of Nelson Mandela as president and coming to power of African National Congress, they didn't try to change the system overnight. They adopted 5-year period for the transition from apartheid system to a democratic South Africa. And there they did it in a more harmonious manner without creating much crises. So this was about the transition. Then there has been bureaucratic hurdles because our bureaucracy was cultivated on this spirit of centralization. They were not mentally prepared for this type of transfer of powers to the regions. So that hurdle came. And not only by the bureaucracy, but also by the technocrats who were there operating in Islamabad in different ministries, in advisory positions or on regular basis. They were not mentally prepared to see a system devolving in this effective manner. So this centrist mindset was a big hurdle. Unfortunately, this centrist mindset was there among the political class of the country also. Quite interestingly, the first voice against this 18th Amendment, which I heard, that was in Islamabad, in a round table, when the then Education Minister, Sardar Asif Ahmed Ali, who was in People's Party in those days, he spoke against the 18th Amendment. So the people there, they asked that if you were against 18th Amendment and you think that education shouldn't be provincialized, you should have said it when the Constitution Committee was formulating this advice or this amendment. Then that amendment must have gone to the cabinet. After its approval, it went to the National Assembly and the Senate. You didn't object to it anywhere. And now that it has been passed by the Parliament and it has been become part of the Constitution, you are saying that you are against it. And he simply said that this is my personal view. So one also thinks that what's a personal view in a parliamentary form of government? In a parliamentary system, you have the collective responsibility of the cabinet, and whoever is a member of the cabinet can differ with a proposition when it is being discussed in the cabinet. But once it is adopted by the cabinet, then the whole cabinet is responsible for it. And if one doesn't agree to it, even then, in that case, there is one option and one should quit the cabinet. There is no concept of personal opinion in this collective responsibility of cabinet system. So this was one attitude shown by one member of our political class, but later we found out that a number of people started talking about against the 18th Amendment. So I would say that the lack of political will on the part of the political class itself had been a hindrance in the implementation of the 18th Amendment. Then there is another related issue of social ownership. Whenever something of this size is done in a country, people are prepared mentally for it. And a sort of ownership among the people is created. Federalism is not merely a constitutional device. I would read to you what Professor W.S. Livingston wrote in his famous note on the nature of federalism, a very small sentence. He says that federalism has to be understood as a sociological phenomenon, that is, a function not of constitution but of societies. Federations succeed not only because they are there well placed in the constitutional structure, but they succeed if they are rooted in the ethos of the people, if they are rooted in the way of thinking of the people, if the people are prepared to accept pluralism, if the people are prepared to appreciate the diversities in the society, and if the people are prepared or they are made to believe that diversities are not bad things, diversities are things which should be rejoiced, then in such societies people come together and they, with this mindset, they respond to their institutions, and institutions also work more harmoniously in such societies. Unfortunately, our political leaders, our political parties did not prepare people of Pakistan to realize what the 18th Amendment stood for, and they did not create social ownership for the 18th Amendment. This, to me, is a big, big failure of our political class. Then there is this issue of local government elections. Of course, federalism, by and large, primarily talks about two layers of government, that is the federal government and the provincial government. But the spirit of federalism is not this, that the power should be devolved from one level to the next level. The spirit of federalism says that power should devolve to the grassroots level. And if that is the case, then the local government institutions are very important. In the last 5 years, what have we seen? The provincial assemblies are rejoicing in having more powers. The provincial governments are enjoying the more powers. The funds have filtered down to the provinces, but they have not filtered down further to the localities and to the neighborhoods, where you have to create schools, where you have to create dispensaries, where you have to put lamps on the roads, and where you have all sorts of issues that need to be resolved at the lowest level of governance. It's only in Balochistan that they have held the local body elections, and for the 3 other provinces, even though Supreme Court has interfered, and had it not interfered, perhaps our provincial leaderships would not have thought about it, and now we are listening that in near future they would be holding local government elections. I would come to the final part of my talk by suggesting a few things which I think that there is room for further improvement in our constitution. First of all, as students of constitutional history, we all should realize that no constitution is final. Human society is a living organism, and with the passage of time, new issues come up. And good institutions are those which are mindful of the social changes, and they respond appropriately to those changes. There are a number of issues which need to be addressed. One wonders why, even in this very large exercise entertained by the Constitution Committee while devising the 18th Amendment, they didn't think about the federally administered tribal areas. We are living in the 21st century, and still we have federally administered tribal areas and provincially administered tribal areas. One may say that what's wrong in it? If a certain territory of the country is declared as Fata or Pata, but there is a great measure of concern involved, because if you have areas which are distinct from the other regular areas, regular provinces of the country, it has direct impact on the character of citizenship in that society. So, in a modern society, there should be a common citizenship. Laws should be applicable on all type of people. So, some decision should be taken about tribal areas. Either they should be merged with the existing provinces, or they should be made separate province, because without doing so, we are cultivating the culture of vested interests, and we know that the tribal chieftains have their vested interest in the continuation of the existing system. I would also say that there is need for a constitutional court in Pakistan. Supreme Court is overwhelmed with cases, and in certain federations they have constitutional courts which address the issues pertaining to the constitution and the interpretation of the constitution. At present, for example, our Supreme Court is discussing the issue of 18th Amendment, and a whole set of arguments have been put that the 18th Amendment has changed the character of the original constitution, and this is the position taken by Mr. Pirzada. But the counter arguments are also there. So I would say that in order to address such constitutional issues, there should be a separate constitution code in the country. I'm also a firm believer of the reform in the Senate of Pakistan also. Senate is the house of the units actually. It is the house of the federation. And in a federation, Senate, the upper house, has great importance. So the federal budget or the money bill should be sent to the Senate also. I once asked Mr. J. Rahim, who was the first Secretary General of People's Party and who also served as a federal minister in Mr. Bhutto's first cabinet, about why Senate has not been given the power to discuss the money bill, or why the money bill was not presented to the Senate. And he was of the opinion that since Senate is not directly elected, there is possibility of creating a vested interest there also if a money bill was sent to the Senate. So to me the solution is this, that in order to make Senate what it should actually be, we should think about electing Senate directly. Instead of provincial governments, provincial assemblies electing the senators should be elected by the people directly. This is my suggestion. I would also say that perhaps this is about time that we should start thinking about giving a role to the provinces in the amendment of the Constitution also. In United States, you cannot amend the Constitution without taking into consideration the consent of the states. At least the majority of the states should give consent to an amendment. Otherwise, there is a possibility that one political formation having majority in the parliament would be able to amend the Constitution. So far, it has not happened in a very adverse manner. But had that clause been there, perhaps Mr. Bhutto would not have been able to introduce 2 or 3 amendments in the Constitution which had direct bearing on the role of the judiciary. Similarly, Mr. Nawaz Sharif in his second term perhaps would not have been able to float the 15th constitutional bill, which he got approved from the National Assembly, but before it could be passed by the Senate, his government was removed. So that amendment, had it been passed by the Senate also, would have given very authoritarian powers to Mr. Nawaz Sharif. So keeping those things in mind, I think a provincial role in the adoption of the amendment should be considered. I am also someone who believes that given the social structure of Pakistan and given the fact that we have parliamentary form of government, which implies that whoever comes from the rural areas is by and large comes from the landed aristocracy. And in the parliamentary form of government, since you have territorial constituencies, therefore there is more likelihood of rural social elite becoming the political elite of the country. Why is it that particular set of people always get elected to the assembly? We cannot oppose parliamentary system because parliamentary system suits our other sort of characteristics of our society. And perhaps it would be ideal if we have land reforms in the country, and the land reforms are done in a manner that the social power of the rural elite which combines with its political power, reduces. But if that is not happening in the near future, perhaps a good way would be to talk about functional representation in the National Assembly. By functional representation, I mean representation for the peasants of the country, representation for the working class, for the factory workers, and representation for the professional class. If we can consider giving representation to one underprivileged section of the society, that is women, we can also think about giving representation to another or other underprivileged sections of the society, which are the peasants of the country, or agricultural labor, or the factory workers, industrial labor, and the professional groups. If ulema can be given representation in the Senate, why can't workers be given representation in the Senate of Pakistan? So, finally, I would say that we have a very rich chapter on fundamental rights in our Constitution. But these fundamental rights are there only in the Constitution. By inserting certain right in the chapter of fundamental rights does not automatically mean that this right has been given to the people and people are in fact exercising these rights. For that we need to have institutional network. For that we need laws, and we need to see how many fundamental rights given in the Constitution have been translated into laws by the federal government and by the provincial assemblies. So, ladies and gentlemen, these are certain random thoughts on the 18th constitutional amendment, and thank you, and I'll be happy to respond to your queries.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an enlightening discussion. And now the House is open for questions. Please introduce yourself and then your question.
Sir, I am Sajid from NHCR. Thank you very much. I feel myself lucky to avail the opportunity to hear you such a enlightening lecture, sir. Thanks God that we have experienced this paradigm shift in the constitutional history of Pakistan in our life. What I feel sometimes that there are certain fears that this will be rolled back sometime. Some powers are thinking to roll it back. And as you mentioned, the Council of Common Interests report should be presented in the Parliament. And its meetings are not convened regularly and reports are not published. And recently, I have heard that the ministry which is controlling this Council of Common Interest, Inter-Provincial Coordination Ministry, it is also being removed. Is it so? Or is
it is also being
removed? They are going to replace it with some other ministry. If it is done so, or if it is being planned so, will it be a step back towards rolling this amendment back and going again to that deadlock of central province relationship?
Sajid Sahab, I think that of course there are forces who are pitted against the 18th Amendment. I have talked about the centralized mindset. There are institutions in the country who are not happy with this whole devolution. We are knowledgeable about the way of thinking of our establishment. Of course, as historians, all of you must be knowing that who was the mind behind the creation of one unit. Ayub Khan, in his biography, writes that He conceived the idea when he was in England in his hotel room, and he was thinking about Pakistan's problems, and then he sat down and wrote his points, and that's how Sindh, Punjab and Frontier, they were all merged, and all the states were merged and one unit was created. This is a mindset which has been inherited by certain institutions of the country. So this is there. I would say that primarily it is a conflict between the forces of centralization and the forces of peripheralization. 18th Amendment was a very good, I would say, compromise, theoretical compromise or philosophical compromise. But if it is not being accepted by someone, and if those at the helm of powers are trying to undo 18th Amendment, perhaps they would be able to do it, but they don't know what are the dangers implied in it. Because after giving powers to the provinces, no matter if they are making use of them to the optimal or not, but if you take the powers back, they will not allow to do so. And then our provinces are quite vigilant about the acts of the center. So much so that there has been certain differences of opinion between the government of Punjab and the federal government. Two brothers are, chief executives, one at the center and the other in Punjab, and still in certain matters there is difference of opinion at the operational level. So in this environment, if you would try to roll back the 18th Amendment, God forbid, that would be the end of this federation.
And sir, what about this IPC ministry? And I think Council of Common Interest is the most important institution.
Council of Common Interest is more important, and for some time it was operating from the Ministry of Interprovincial Coordination. Ministries can be created and they can be removed. They do not have constitutional basis actually. You can rename a ministry. You can create a new ministry. So if I haven't heard that Interprovincial Coordination Ministry is going, it's a very important ministry. But maybe someone is thinking that instead of it, some more effective ministry should be created. That is something that can be done within the framework of the Constitution. But I think that the functions which the Interprovincial Coordination Ministry is doing, whether they are done by this very ministry or some other ministry, those functions are important. In fact, the arena of those functions should be enlarged. I'm a member of the Board of Governors of Sindh Textbook Board, and there I have suggested, and I have suggested to the Sindh Education Minister also, that in federal governments, interprovincial coordination at different level and intergovernmental coordination at different level is very important. So you should meet the education ministers of other three provinces, formally or informally, and share what is being done in your province and what is being done in other provinces. Similarly, the chairpersons of textbook boards in Punjab, Sindh, Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, they should meet each other and they should converse with each other about what is being done in their province. So, in Germany there are something like 5,000 agreements between different federating units. So it's a complex arrangement, but this complexity is quite, normal and natural in a federal arrangement. I don't know why we feel shy in meeting other people. Why we confine ourselves to Balochistan and confine ourselves to Punjab. Why don't we reach out to the other province, meet our counterparts there, share with them what we are thinking and what they are doing. For example, in Sindh, we have started changing the courses. And we have started changing the courses, making them more rational, more pro-people. In class 3 and class 4 school books of Sindh, now you will find chapters on Malala Yousafzai, who is not Sindhi. You will find a chapter on Arfa Karim, who was not Sindhi. So if this type of thing is done in one province, such things can be done in other provinces also.
Sir, thank you very much. I don't have proper diction to use to thank you for your kind enlightenment regarding the constitutional history of Pakistan, with particular emphasis on the 18th Amendment. Sir, I am a student of history and political science is not my domain of research. But I got 2 courses to ask to understand what is going on and what was going on in the course of making and implementation of the 18th Amendment. First question regarding how the intellectuals were involved in those amendments and those paradigm shifts. And second question is pertaining to how it could happen that it was implemented in a haste without giving much needed time to implement in a proper manner. Thank you, sir.
Well, as far as the role of intellectuals is concerned, of course intellectuals were not directly invited. No such exercise was done that Mr. Umar Hayat should be talked to and Ashfaq Ali Mirza Saab should be talked to, or Dr. Saiba. But the Constitution Commission circulated a questionnaire on which responses were given, and something like 900 responses came from the people, including certain political parties, pressure groups, professional groups, and individuals. More so, I would say that within the Constitution Committee, fortunately, there were people who were not only the members of the Parliament, they were intellectual in their own right. For example, Raza Rabbani Saab to me is an intellectual. Professor Khurshid Ahmed of Jamaat-e-Islami to me is an intellectual. Afrasiab Khattak has been a political activist as well as I regard him as an intellectual. Dr. Abdul Malik was a member of that committee. He is an intellectual. So, luckily, the people chosen by the different political parties having representation in the parliament and the people who were made members of the Constitution Committee, they were fairly well-informed, well-read people. So, that's it. Now, as far as the haste involved, I think that there was some, unsaid fear that if this process is prolonged, it would liquidate some type of, a curtain was drawn between the committee's proceedings and the media. And I think that perhaps it was justified also, because had it gone to the TV channels, God knows what would have happened, because our TV channels generate so-called debate on something, but it always remains inconclusive. At the end of the day, you are confused, and TV channels get another issue to take up. They have not, in a way, fostered a political discourse, a democratic discourse in Pakistan. In the last 10, 12 years, since when we had these TV channels, one thing they have forced upon our minds is that politics is bad, democracy is bad, politicians are bad. And rest of the world is very good. They have never criticized the bureaucrats, they have never criticized the members of the establishment or the corruption in their ranks. It is a political class which has become the target of TV channels. And with due respect, if someone is here, but this is my considered opinion, they have chosen to present to the people those politicians who cannot be defended, of course, but they have totally neglected those politicians of this country, of the past and at present, who are good people, who are not involved in corruption, because that does not sell. They have their own yardstick of what is good and what is bad, and whatever increases their rating, that is more important to them.
मैडम सलाउद्दीन है और मैं कायदे आज़म यूनिवर्सिटी का स्टूडेंट हूँ। सर मेरा क्वेश्चन ये था कि गवर्नर राज, जैसे कि 18th अमेंडमेंट के बाद था कि प्रोविंशियल अटानमी दी गई है, पर बाद में ये हुआ कि बलूचिस्तान में इंसिडेंट हुआ हज़ारा कम्युनिटी वाला, उसके बाद गवर्नर राज वहाँ पे इम्पोज किया गया। और अब जो इलेक्शन हुई थी उसके बाद फौरन ये जब सिंध में पीपल्स पार्टी गवर्नमेंट बनी तो वहाँ पे भी ये था कि पीपल्स पार्टी को ये थ्रेट आ गया था कि आज गवर्नर मतलब चेंज हो रहा है, उसके बाद गवर्नर राज लगेगा। तो इसको आप फेडरलिज्म के किस पर्सपेक्टिव में देखते हैं? ये तो फिर फेडरलिज्म के साथ नाइंसाफी। और दूसरा सवाल मेरा ये था कि आपने कहा कि स्प्रेड को मानना, कि दूसरों सूबों को मानना ही फेडरलिज्म का एक स्प्रेड है। और हम देखते हैं कि एक मूवमेंट चल रही है सिंध बलूचिस्तान हो, वहाँ पे कि उनकी ज़बानों को कौमी मतलब कि वहाँ ट्रांसनल ज़बान का दर्जा दिया जाए, तो वो उनको ना देना एक स्प्रेड के खिलाफ नहीं जा रहा ये फेडरलिज्म के?
देखिए, जहाँ तक गवर्नर राज का ताल्लुक है, there has been talk of गवर्नर राज in Sindh, but लगा तो नहीं वहाँ पे गवर्नर राज। बलूचिस्तान में एक टेम्परेरी फेज में बात रही, लेकिन ये भी मैं आपको बताऊं कि गवर्नर राज इज नॉट अ वेरी गुड थिंग, बट इट इज पार्ट ऑफ द फेडरल अरेंजमेंट। यू नो, in India they have had more than 100 times they had Governor Raj. It is in exceptional cases when law and order is totally broken down, that in that case the provincial assembly's powers are, subdued. It's not ideal, but it is part of the federal arrangement. Now coming to your second question about languages, I don't know why the Committee on 18th Amendment did not entertain the idea of adopting national languages or various languages of Pakistan as national languages. Personally, I think that it's not something, wrong if we accept all the languages of Pakistan as national languages. It would not harm our brotherhood, it would not harm our federation to declare the Pakistani languages, and they are all very advanced languages. Sindhi was official language during the British period also. So if we declare our languages national languages, it won't do any harm. Secondly, I would say that we should identify the difference between national language and official language. You can have 50 national languages, simply say in your constitution that these 50 languages or these 12 languages are our national languages. To adopt a national language as an official language is the issue that has to be decided by the province. In 1972, Sindh province adopted Sindhi as official language, Balochistan decided not to have Balochi language as their official language. So to have national language, to identify certain languages as national languages, is the recognition of a reality. It's not against federation, it is not against the idea of Pakistan. It is not against Urdu. I tell you that in 1948, when Bengalis were asking for Bengali to be made national language, it was decided that you can have Bengali as the official language. So if they could have Bengali as the official language of East Pakistan, what was wrong in declaring Bengali as the national language also? And I tell you, Quaid-e-Azam had asked Sardar Baldev Singh to join Pakistan, and he offered him a blank paper saying that whatever demands you want to put in it, you are free to put it. He did not agree. But had he put the demand that our language would also be a national language of Pakistan, what would have been the answer of Janasa? So I think that we should not be fearful about recognition of languages as national languages. Germany recognizes 3 or 4 national languages, so does Switzerland, so does Canada, etc. What's wrong in it? I don't know. Yes.
My question is not directly with the 18th Amendment or with things which are discussed at the 18th Amendment. But if you have to make certain amendments, there was a committee to amend the Constitution at such a large scale, why those amendments were not amended which were introduced by Ziaul Haq?
I think you are referring to those particular amendments which Ziaul Haq introduced in the domain of Hudud. Hudud was ordinance actually. What constitutional amendments he introduced was regarding making the objectives resolution a functional part of the Constitution, or Sharia Code, Federal Sharia Code, so on and so forth. My understanding is this, that the 27 members of the Constitution Committee knew each other's weaknesses and knew each other's perceptions. Right in the beginning, it was decided that we would do our utmost to evolve a consensus on whatever we are suggesting. That is why, instead of writing notes of dissent, you will find notes of reiteration in their amendment. So it was a give and take sort of arrangement. Jamiyat-e-Ulama Islam Fazlur Rahman was sitting there, and Jamaat-e-Islami was sitting there. They wouldn't have agreed to the proposal that the clause pertaining to the president, that the president should be a Muslim, that they couldn't agree to remove it. Similarly, there were other clauses on which the Islamist parties said right in the beginning that we wouldn't like to touch these. So a compromise was made that, well, we are not touching these. For example, Islam being the state religion of Pakistan, that is there in the constitution, or presidential qualification, so on and so forth. Similarly, the ulama or the religious Islamic parties were made to agree on the issues of provincial autonomy. So it was a give and take. Moreover, all parties were concerned, they had their prime focus on certain things. Muslim League Nawaz was more concerned about the removal of that clause that had made that third time prime ministership unconstitutional. So that part of 17th Amendment was removed, and for that they removed the whole 17th Amendment, and whatever was good in the 17th Amendment, that was separately incorporated in the 18th Amendment. So it was a compromise between the Islamists and the liberals sitting in the committee.
Sir, I am a student of history. Sir, I have to talk about two things. You have given a very good and comprehensive lecture on 18th Amendment. But جس پہ مجھے بات کرنی ہے, جب میں 18th Amendment پہ پڑھ رہا تھا, میں نے ایک چیز نوٹ کی کہ پنجابی میں بہت اچھی ایک محاورہ ہے کہ دوسروں کے گھر بچہ پیدا ہو گیا تو انہوں نے چوم چوم کے ہی مار دیا. تو یہی پروونسز کے ساتھ حساب ہو رہا ہے کہ انہیں 18th Amendment وہ انجوائے تو کر رہے ہیں پاور, لیکن ان کے پاس وہ مطلب نالج نہیں ہے کہ اس سے کیسے بینیفٹ لیں وہ 18th Amendment سے, اس کے وہ بینیفٹ سے فائدہ نہیں اٹھا پا رہے ہیں. اس کے لیے ہمیں کیا کرنا چاہیے کہ ان کے لیے یہ تو اچھا ہے کہ ہم 18th Amendment پہ لیکچر لے رہے ہیں, لیکن ہمیں وہ پروونسز کے ممبرس کو, پروونشل اسمبلیز کے پارلیمنٹ کے ممبرس کو لیکچر دینے کی ضرورت ہے, انہیں ٹرین کرنے کی ضرورت ہے کہ اس کے کیا بینیفٹس ہیں. یہ ایک سجیشن ہے. اور آپ نے ایک سینٹ کی بات کی کہ سینٹ کے ممبرس کو ڈائریکٹ الیکٹ کرنا چاہیے. ہمارے پاس ہم ایم این ایز ایم پی ایز الیکٹ کرتے ہیں اس بیس کے اوپر کہ کس کے پاس اسلحہ زیادہ ہے, کس کے پاس پمپ اینڈ شو, جو زیادہ کرے گا اسے الیکٹ کر دیا جائے گا. یہ نہیں پتا کہ اس نے پارلیمنٹ میں جا کے کرنا کیا ہے. تو ہم جو کہ سینٹ ایک رسپانسبل پرسنس کے لیے ہوتی ہے, تو اگر ڈائریکٹ الیکشن کروائیں گے تو وہ کیا پروڈیوس کر پائیں گے.
اچھا, پہلی بات تو یہ کہ جو آپ نے مثال دی نا کہ جی 18ویں ترمیم میں بہت کچھ اچھا ہے, لیکن پروونسز جو ہیں وہ اس کو اس طرح سے نہیں کر پا رہے ہیں, صرف اس کو اپریشیٹ ہی کیا جا رہا ہے. پھر ہمیں ایسا نہیں ہے. ریئلسٹک ہو کے آپ دیکھیں تو ٹیک آف ہو چکا ہے. خیبر پختونخوا میں بھی ٹیک آف ہوا ہے, سندھ میں بھی ہوا ہے, دوسرے صوبوں میں بھی ہوا ہے. ایک سوسائٹی میں ایک جنرل جو ایک لیتھارجی ہے پوری سوسائٹی میں ہے, وہ سینٹر میں بھی ہے, وہ صرف پروونسز میں نہیں ہے. اسی طرح سے چیزوں کو امپلیمنٹ کرنے کے لیے جس انرجی کی اور جس شوق کی اور جس ولولے کی ضرورت ہے وہ ہمارے یہاں پورے پبلک سیکٹر کے اندر مسنگ نظر آتی ہے. تو اس حد تک تو ہے, لیکن ایسا نہیں ہے کہ اتنا ڈوم سے بھی سیناریو نہیں ہے کہ پروونسز نے کچھ نہیں کیا. پروونسز کے ریونیو جنریشن بڑے ہیں, اور اگر نہیں بڑھے تو وہ سینٹر کے بھی نہیں بڑھے. جو ٹارگیٹ آپ نے رکھا تھا, کل ہی یہ بات آئی ہے پریس میں کہ جو ٹارگیٹ تھا اس ٹارگیٹ سے سینٹر بھی پیچھے ہے, فیڈرل گورنمنٹ بھی اور پروونشل گورنمنٹس بھی پیچھے ہیں. تو وہ گورننس کے ایشوز ہیں, وہ ریونیو کلیکشن کی مشینری کے ایشوز ہیں, وہ ہے. لیکن اتنا بھی ڈومس ڈے نہیں ہے کہ کچھ نہیں ہو رہا. ہو رہا ہے, لیکن جس رفتار سے ہونا چاہیے تھا اس رفتار سے نہیں ہو رہا. Now, second point you raised is about the election of the Senate. آپ یہ کہتے ہیں کہ پروونشل اسمبلی جو نیشنل اسمبلی میں ٹکٹس دیے جاتے ہیں وہ جن بیسس کے اوپر دیے جاتے ہیں, تو جب ڈائریکٹ الیکشن سینٹ کا ہوگا تو وہاں بھی یہ ہوگا, یہی کہہ رہے ہیں نا. تو ابھی انڈائریکٹ الیکشن میں کیا ہو رہا ہے؟ انڈائریکٹ الیکشن میں بھی یہی ہو رہا ہے کہ پولیٹیکل پارٹیز جو ہیں انٹرویو کرتی ہیں کینڈیڈیٹس کی, اور ان سے پوچھا جاتا ہے کہ تم کتنا پیسہ دے رہے ہو پارٹی کے فنڈ میں. اور یہی وجہ ہے کہ آپ کی سینٹ پہ بھی جو لوگ آ رہے ہیں چند ایک کو چھوڑ کے, وہ میرٹ پہ نہیں آ رہے ہیں. وہ پارٹی لیڈرشپ کو جس طرح سے بھی کنونس ہونے کا, جو بھی ہر پارٹی لیڈرشپ کا طریقہ ہے اس طرح سے کنونس ہوتے ہیں, اور پھر اشارہ کر دیا جاتا ہے پروونشل اسمبلی کے ممبرس کو اپنی پارٹی کے کہ تمہیں اس کو ووٹ دینا ہے. انہیں پتہ بھی نہیں ہوتا کہ ہم کس کو ووٹ دے رہے ہیں, لیکن پارٹی نے کہا ہے تو وہ اس کو ووٹ دے رہے ہوتے ہیں. تو میرج تو یہاں بھی نہیں ہے, انڈائریکٹ سسٹم میں بھی نہیں ہے. سو فار دیٹ ویل ہیو ٹو ریفارم آور سسٹم. ابھی ہم نے بلڈ ایکٹ کے ساتھ ایک اسٹڈی کی ہے پولیٹیکل پارٹیز کے اوپر, جو چھپ بھی گئی ہے رپورٹ, انٹرنل ڈیموکریسی ان پولیٹیکل پارٹیز. اس میں ہمیں بڑا موقع ملا ساری پولیٹیکل پارٹیز کی لیڈرشپ سے انٹریکٹ کرنے کا، اور ہم نے جاننا چاہا کہ پارٹیز اپنے کینڈیڈیٹس کیسے منتخب کرتی ہیں، پارٹی لیڈرشپ کس طرح. There is a term used in Pakistan called electables. یعنی you are electable اگر آپ اپنے علاقے کے بڑے زمیندار ہیں اور آپ جو ایک بڑی برادری آپ کی لوکیلٹی میں رہتی ہے آپ کی، اور آپ کے پاس پیسہ ہے اچھا خاصا، آپ پارٹی کے فنڈ میں بھی دے سکتے ہیں، تو you are electable. We have recommended that reform should be introduced in the structures of the political parties, and there if political parties act should be amended, we should do that. There the role of party organizations or grassroots organizations of the parties and the workers, and the role of the party conventions and the role of the party councils should be highlighted, and this role should be recognized for the selection of the candidates. Abhi kya hai ki we have seen in the case of senators, we have seen in the case of women representatives. سندھ کی ایک ممبر تھی، وہ پیپلز پارٹی کی طرف سے 5 سال انہوں نے پروونشل اسمبلی میں شی واز ریپرزینٹڈ. اگلے 5 سال کے لیے انہیں ٹکٹ نہیں ملا، تو انہوں نے، ہم نے جب ان سے پوچھا کہ بھئی آپ کو اس دفعہ ٹکٹ نہیں ملا، تو انہوں نے جو فریز استعمال کیا دیٹ اپلائز ٹو آل پولیٹیکل پارٹیز. انہوں نے کہا جی ہماری پارٹی میں اب پیراشوٹ سے لوگ آنے لگے ہیں. Means کہ someone is related to Mr. So and so who lives abroad and who is close friend of our party leader, so his wife has been given ticket of the National Assembly. So this parachuting should be sort of checked, and for that role of the party workers, role of the party's organizations, councils and conventions, that should be incorporated in the Political Parties Act. Immediately at the Juiz hand. Dr. Abbas.
Dr. Saab, thank you for a very enlightening and a lucid, clear account of the 18th Amendment. I just wanted to raise 2 points which I feel are a drawback or a weakness of the Constitution, which is the powers of the Chief Election Commissioner, which should have been a very independent body, like you have in India. And I think that has given rise to a lot of problems that have come up. And secondly, I think not enough attention was given to local bodies. We have our own panchayat system which was there. Had this been more emphatic, I don't know how it could have been made so more powerful body in the whole structure of the Constitution. But I don't know how India has evolved it. But I feel that it's a very important part of the Constitution, which should have been more
Yes.
clear.
Dr. Sabha, as far as Chief Election Commissioner is concerned, you know, after long debates, our Election Commission was reformed. Parliament was also given some role in it. And when Justice Fakhruddin Ji Ibrahim was made the Chief Election Commissioner, we were all very happy because he is such an honest person, person of integrity. But then it turned out that the whole system faulted.
But he was not independent.
He was not independent, that is also true. But then again it comes to the office of the Chief Election Commissioner, the question you raised about. I would say that the good thing in India is this. You know, what's the difference between India and Pakistan? We, after so much of, thinking, made a retired judge as the Chief Election Commissioner. Now, a judge can be a very good jurist, he can be a very, very honest person, but he does not have any experience of working with an administrative, hierarchy, which is the qualification possessed by civil servants. In India, they have always made an honest and forthright civil servant as the Chief Election Commissioner. So in Pakistan, I'm sure that we can find good retired civil servants who can serve as the Chief Election Commissioner, because they would be able to understand how this system works and how the election officers and the entire hierarchy of electioneering is appointed and how it is made accountable. So that type of experience is needed in a Chief Election Commissioner, I would say. Secondly, as far as the local government is concerned, it's a provincial subject. And Constitution only says that local government institutions should be made. It rests with the provinces what they make of it. Unfortunately, our provinces do not pay heed to that. It is only after the interference of the Supreme Court that the rest of the 3 provinces are now going for it. And Balochistan had done it without any, dictate of the Supreme Court. In India, the panchayat system works well, and it is woven in the Indian society. It is so well integrated in the Indian society that you cannot think of governance in India without taking into consideration their panchayat system. And one reason why the constitutional continuity has gone in India and why democracy has continued in India, it is appropriately functioned at the neighborhood and the grassroots levels. Had it not been then, mere Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha do not represent Indian democracy.
Sir, my name is Abdul Latif Bhatti. I am a student of Pakistan Study, MSc Pakistan Study Tax Department. So my question is, I want to ask you about the role of HCC after the 18th Amendment.
This is, a hot topic in Islamabad. Role of HEC. 18th Amendment did not talk about HEC, but in the Constitution, in the Federal List, there is one item, one word, standards. Now it depends on the system and the people who are operating that system how to make use of this word or how to interpret this word. By making a standard as the vehicle for acquiring whatever type of powers you want, you can do it. Tomorrow you will take all the agriculture, take it to the center, and you say that we are looking after the standards of agriculture. You can take industry back from the provinces to the federation and you can say we are looking after the standards of industry. So that was the clause which was made use of, or which was there in the mind of Dr. Ataur Rahman Saab, who went to the Supreme Court saying that if standards is the domain of the federal government, then HEC looks after their standards. When Sindh tried to establish its provincial higher education commission, a lot of protest was made by the centrist lobby. But thanks God that Punjab also followed suit and they established their provincial higher education commission with Nizam Saab as its head. Now Nizam Saab was once a very strong supporter of HEC, Central HEC. Recently I met him in Islamabad in a meeting and I said, Dr. Saab, how you feel now that you are heading the Punjab HEC? So, it depends on the motives of the people, it depends on the intentions of the people. I think that if all the 4 provinces have their HECs, it would not make much difference. Central HEC should also be there. It would remain there. Provincial HECs would have their own, mandate of things to do. There is a lot to do within the provinces. Standardization of syllabi in the universities, the financial uplift of the universities, then the compatibility between the public sector universities and the private sector universities. There is a whole lot of agenda which can be addressed by the provincial HECs, and they will operate within the financial confines of the provincial government. So I don't think that it will make much difference. Allama Iqbal had said that आईने नौ से डरना तर्ज़े कोहन पे अड़ना मंजिल यही कठिन है कौमों की जिंदगी में. We are very shy of new things. कोई नया आइडिया हो, कोई नई चीज हो, हम लोग बहुत घबरा रहे होते हैं कि जी हम तबाह हो जाएंगे. हमने नेशनल लैंग्वेजेस को नेशनल लैंग्वेजेस मान लिया. और जिस जुबान के अंदर इतना लिटरेचर हो, सिंधी, बलोची, पंजाबी, सराइकी, पश्तो, जितना इनका लिटरेचर है, इनकी तहजीबी रवायतें हैं, इनका कल्चर है, इनके आइकॉन्स हैं, जनाब शाह लतीफ को समझने में बरसों लग जाएंगे. इतनी गहराई उनकी शायरी के अंदर है. और मैं तो एक जगह शाह लतीफ पे मैंने मजमून पढ़ा. मैंने कहा कि जी मेरी दो माजूरियां तो सबसे पहले कबूल कर ले. एक तो ये कि मुझे सिंधी नहीं आती और मैंने शेख रियाज के तर्जमे से समझा है, और दूसरा मुझे म्यूजिक नहीं आती. शाह लतीफ की शायरी को आप समझ ही नहीं सकते जब तक सुरों का इल्म आपको ना हो, क्योंकि उन्होंने तो चैप्टराइजेशन जो है वो सुरों के हवाले से की हुई है. ही वाज सच अ जीनियस. अब जिस जुबान के अंदर ऐसे जीनियस बैठे हों, पश्तो के अंदर, अब बलोची, राबिया खुजदारी, हम आज फेमिनिज्म की मैडम बात करते हैं. उस खातून को सोचिए जो सदियों पहले जो है वो शायरी कर रही थी, और इतनी बोल्ड शायरी उसकी थी. उसने मकामी रवायात से बगावत की. और हम अपने सारे वर्से को छोड़ दें, नजरअंदाज कर दें, तो क्यों? सिर्फ इसलिए कि हम आईने नौ से डरते हैं. हम एक्सेप्ट करें. These are all our national languages. These are all our national cultures. Rich heritage. इसके साथ आप देखिए पाकिस्तान कितना बड़ा बन के निकलेगा, मुल्क कितना रिच बन के दुनिया के सामने आएगा. हम डरते हैं.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an enlightening discussion and quite comprehensive answers to the questions.